Welcome to the Ready for Merge show, the podcast about what code changes are ready for merge in Bitcoin and Ethereum. I'm your host, Christine D. Kim, and this is the first episode that I am recording back in New York City since the start of the new year, 2026. I don't know if I had mentioned it in prior episodes, but I was actually in Canada over the holidays. So for the last couple of recordings that I did, my listeners probably saw and noticed like a little bit of a different background while I was recording over there. But yeah, this is the first show that I'm recording in 2026 where I'm back in the city, back in my usual space. I know some of you guys think that my background is kind of bland, but I kind of like it. It's like minimalist. Um, and yeah, I'm back now and it's pretty nice. I kind of mentioned on the biweekly brief recording that I did a couple weeks ago that since the holidays have ended, I have actually had a lot more time to rest and have been less busy than I was over the holidays. So yeah, that's been good. Um, Last week on the show, I had on Calvin Kim. He was the first Bitcoin developer to join the show, and we talked about his Utrixo project, and we talked a little bit about his career as a Bitcoin developer. This week, today, I have got a new biweekly brief for you that will catch you up on all the important developments, updates on what you need to know with how the Bitcoin and the Ethereum protocols are changing. So specifically, I'm going to give you an update today on Glamsterdam, which is the next major hard fork, the next major upgrade on Ethereum. Developers are starting to progress in their efforts to figure out exactly what features are going to be prioritized in the Glamsterdam upgrade. And then I've got a few updates for you since I last did this biweekly brief on the Bitcoin governance process. There's a new Bitcoin Core maintainer since we last spoke, and there's also a slightly updated and revised BIP process, which is the process in which new features and ideas for changing Bitcoin, how they get proposed and how the community can get involved in reviewing these ideas, proposing them themselves, and like moving it through the the Bitcoin governance process. So yeah, we've got some cool updates, some cool changes that are important to the evolution of Bitcoin and Ethereum. So thanks for joining. Thanks for joining another show, another Ready for Merge episode. Let's get right into it and start with the Ethereum updates first. I like to change it up, every couple weeks. Sometimes we do Bitcoin first, sometimes we do Ethereum. But this week, today, we're going to start with the Ethereum updates. So as I mentioned, Glamsterdam scope is settling down somewhat. It is by no means finalized. Developers will still have to, week by week, figure out what features and code changes are going to be prioritized in this upgrade. But at the very least, they have finalized their short list of candidates. So what I mean by that is the CFI'd EIPs. CFI'd EIPs, that stands for Considered for Inclusion Ethereum Improvement Proposals. And funnily enough, the EIP process, it was based on the BIP process, which was also based on the PIP process. The PIP process stands for Python, I think, improvement proposals. Most of the EIPs that have been CFI'd are part of the shortlist are gas repricing EIPs. So basically, these proposals try and optimize the gas cost, the amount of ETH that somebody would need to pay in order to execute these operations on chain, to get those costs more in line with the actual computational resources required to both execute that operation and if it's going to create new accounts on Ethereum, if it's going to change, say, the smart contract code of a particular application. Perhaps it's going to append new operations or new functionality to a particular smart contract application. Then there's more code that needs to be stored and more code that needs to be kind of added to the Ethereum database. Basically, on Ethereum, there's a bunch of either underpriced or overpriced operations. And when you think about the ultimate end or the ultimate goal of trying to reprice operations on Ethereum, it's ultimately to help the Ethereum protocol scale. So when you increase the size of blocks, the amount of space that there is for operations to be executed. If you have certain operations that are extremely underpriced, which means that the cost to execute those operations on the network and on the node operators, all the computers that are collectively verifying the Ethereum blockchain and reinforcing the rules of the blockchain, the computational resources that are being taken by these computers, these nodes, if that cost is extremely high, but the actual price, the actual amount of ETH that a user is spending to execute that operation, if there's that kind of an imbalance, then if you increase the size of a block and suddenly a lot more people start to actually do that operation on chain, then you could have a kind of a negative scenario where the network, there's just too much of a computational load on nodes, and it could result in the network not being able to process blocks in a timely manner. You could get missed blocks, orphan blocks. You could, just have the network become a lot slower and bogged down if you have a bunch of underpriced operations and you try and scale Ethereum. But of course, on the other side, if you have a lot of overpriced operations, then when you scale Ethereum, you actually have some more room where more of a certain operation can be processed at any given time. And there's room for scale. There's room for more, say, transactions to be included in an Ethereum block. But because the network has priced them too high, users are not taking advantage of the additional scale. So there's a bunch of EIPs that are designed to reprice various operations on chain. And for Ethereum, because it's a general purpose blockchain, you can do so much more than just send ETH, the native asset of the Ethereum blockchain, from one account to another. You have really, truly, you have such flexibility in the kind of programmability that you can have in the way that assets get moved around on chain, what conditions allow you to be able to move certain assets around, and what kind of services that you can build. The possibilities are very limitless on Ethereum. You've got a virtual machine that is how certain computer or programmers call it, like Turing complete. There's infinite flexibility in the way that you can code different applications and services on top of Ethereum. But with the pricing of all these operations, there's clearly some mismatches that are going on with all these operations that have been introduced over time, new features that have been added to Ethereum's virtual machine over time that haven't been priced correctly, and in hindsight, could be readjusted. So lots of EIPs that are related to repricing so far in Glamsterdam. I was going to go into actually the most recent EIP related to repricing that was added to the Glamsterdam shortlist of candidates, the CFI'd list. but I'm just going to skip that because I feel like it's going to go into too much of a technical detail. But if people are interested, I'm going to link to it in the show notes instead, just in case, any of my listeners want to dive deeper into the technical stuff. There's an EIP called EIP 8037, and this one will specifically reprice operations that grow Ethereum state, introduce a mechanism to kind of track state growth on Ethereum. And ensure that operations that make it harder for nodes over time to sync to Ethereum, to make that kind of operation just more costly, and hopefully keep state growth of Ethereum at a rate of, I think developers want it at 100 gigabytes of growth per year. And this is just data that nodes are initially processing and initially need to download in order to sync up to the Ethereum network. So along with EIP 8037, there's 8 others. So in total, there's 9. There's 9 EIPs in the short list of candidates of EIPs that will go into Glamsterdam. There's already 6 that developers have started to implement for the upgrade. And so these EIPs are labeled in the lingo of Ethereum governance as SFI, scheduled for inclusion, which means that they are for sure going into the upgrade. Barring any kind of a major issue with any of these proposals, of course, if developers find some kind of a major flaw in block level access lists or in shrine proposer builder separation, there is a chance that these EIPs the developers might give up on them and not include them in the Glamsterdam upgrade, but that's very unlikely. So these 6 EIPs, which you can learn more about in the show notes of definitely today's episode, developers have already started implementing. And these ones also are pretty focused on scaling Ethereum further through different techniques. There's also a couple of additional features and operations that will help smart contract code developers on Ethereum, but I highlight the number and I highlight how there's already a handful, already 6 features that developers are working on for Glamsterdam. And there's this short list of like 9 other EIPs that are considered for inclusion, just to highlight that the scoping process of Glamsterdam is definitely still ongoing. I don't think that it's going to be likely that developers will be able to include all 9 candidates in the CFI list into Glamsterdam, with the 6 that they're already working on, especially because Ethereum developers seem to be aiming to still ship Glamsterdam by the middle of this year. So we're in almost the end of January now. We've got 5 more months, and the final activation process, where you really want the entire scope of Glamsterdam to be frozen and the implementation of all the proposals to be more or less finalized, you want about a minimum month or 2 months of runway to just be able to take that hardened, frozen implementation for the upgrade and just open up the testing for it more broadly to the wider ecosystem, give time for stakeholders like layer 2s and validators, and staking pools and smart contract developers to get ready for these code changes, and also for themselves to see how these features work with their current operations. So there's a bit of even buffer time and just runway after the code is finalized for the rest of the Ethereum ecosystem to prepare for the upgrade. And developers are really trying to still ship this upgrade on mainnet, on Ethereum, by the middle of this year, which doesn't give them a ton of runway to just continue working on new features within Glamsterdam. So it'll be interesting to see what subset of the considered for inclusion EIPs actually get implemented into Glamsterdam, and what the final scope of Glamsterdam will look like, how comparatively ambitious it may be to initial expectations versus not. It'll be interesting to see how the upgrades, what it actually shapes up to be. And Yeah, I'll keep covering Glamsterdam on future episodes of Ready for Merge. You best believe that future biweekly briefs will share more updates on how the Glamsterdam implementation and scoping process is how it's going. So let's move on to Bitcoin updates now. I've got a couple of exciting updates as it relates to the people and the process in charge of changing the Bitcoin protocol. The first update is that there is a new Bitcoin Core maintainer. His name is The Charlatan, and he started contributing to Bitcoin Core as early as 2019. He is best known for his contributions for the kernel project. We've talked about the kernel project in prior episodes of this show, but basically it's a project to separate out non-consensus critical parts of Bitcoin from the critical parts, consensus critical parts of the software. A little bit more about the charlatan. According to his bio, he graduated from the University of Zurich with a major in computer science and minor in physics. And his work is currently sponsored by a Bitcoin development company called Spiral. I hope, if by any chance this episode gets heard by the charlatan, that he'll come onto the Ready for Merge show and share more details about his background and his career as a Bitcoin developer. I think that would be very cool. So just going to leave that as a note here. The charlatan, he joins 5 other Bitcoin Core maintainers. And these maintainers, they all have various backgrounds, various times in which they started to started to contribute to Bitcoin. They're not all sponsored by Spiral. They have different financial sponsors. But as a whole, Bitcoin Core maintainers differ slightly from the broader group of Bitcoin Core developers because they don't just contribute ideas and contribute and like help address pull requests, different kind of changes to the Bitcoin Core code base. They're not they don't only work on Bitcoin Core and various like software changes to the software, improvements to the software. But they also have commit access to the GitHub repository where the Bitcoin Core software lives. So basically, they have the rights to merge and to finalize various changes to the Bitcoin Core codebase on GitHub. And GitHub is really where it's the primary source where anyone who's interested in how Bitcoin works and just seeing the code base of Bitcoin itself, they go to the GitHub. They go to the GitHub to see the full and download the full software and see the full code for Bitcoin. And so having the rights to make changes to that code base is a pretty important responsibility. I caveat that if you're a maintainer, yes, you are kind of like the final check before any code changes can be merged into the code base and finalized into the code base. But most of the time, even the reviews that maintainers do, the final check that maintainers make to all the code changes that are being worked on for Bitcoin. Usually it's multiple maintainers that are affirming and working together on making sure that any code changes that are integrated into the final version of Bitcoin or into a final like release, major or minor release of Bitcoin Core, making sure that those changes are aligned with project goals and are safe for the Bitcoin Core software to adopt. So it's not like one maintainer has like unilateral control to just change whatever they want about Bitcoin. That code and all the work that they do is done out in the open on GitHub, reviewed by other maintainers. As I said, there's 6, and also reviewed and seen by an even larger group of, say, like 35 or 40 open source developers that might not have merge access, like commit access to the GitHub, but are definitely actively, commenting and actively keeping an eye on all the activity that happens in the Bitcoin Core code base. As I feel like it's the programmers and the developers, and there's also a bunch of non-technical, but also more media-minded folk like me, and a bunch of other kind of publications, um, some of which are people like Block Space Media and Optech, and a bunch of others in the Bitcoin community. There's a Bitcoin Insider, Bitcoin Plus Plus. I'm just shouting these people out because I read their content too. But that I highlight are also looking at the activity of what's happening on the GitHub. And so, yes, these 6 maintainers have the rights to be able to finalize code changes into Bitcoin Core, but their work is by no means, it's not like unilateral control. And it is something that is very highly reviewed and seen, I guess, and double checked with a bunch of a broader group of Bitcoin stakeholders. So yes, every single code change in PR goes through multiple rounds of review by both maintainers and other contributors alike. But it is exciting always when a new maintainer is appointed. I think 6 maintainers is better than 5. It's one more person to have a shared responsibility of stewarding the Bitcoin protocol, which is billions of dollars worth. And I still maintain that there's not enough, I feel like, individuals and people that are stewarding, helping to steward the Bitcoin protocol compared to the value of the asset. So it's always nice when I see more people that are elevated in their roles and getting more deeply involved in the Bitcoin development. But with being a Bitcoin Core maintainer comes quite a bit of visibility. I highlight this because I also want to note and just warn also any users. There's a Bitcoin Core maintainer. Her name is Gloria Zhao, whose X account was hacked. And last I checked, right before this recording, it still is hacked. So any messages, any posts from that account, disregard. Do not click on anything. For anyone who's listening that has been in the crypto space for a while, this kind of warning is so commonplace. Getting hacked is kind of, I feel as though it's a rite of passage in this industry. Hackers are just very primed to target crypto users, specifically very high profile crypto stakeholders. For example, Bitcoin Core maintainers. Gloria is by no means the only kind of like high profile person in our industry that has had her X account hacked, or even worse. I think it was a BIP editor, Luke Dash Jr., who had his public key or private key compromised, and lost even his Bitcoin holdings due to a hack. So yeah, honestly, it's sad. I think that it sucks for that to happen, but it is a reminder that getting hacked is really something that no one is above, and truly that anyone is really susceptible to. It's not clear exactly how Gloria's X account was hacked, but given that it's an X account and most Web2 social media accounts, there's a ton of like social recovery mechanisms for these accounts. these platforms try and make it as easy as possible for users to recover their accounts, not harder. So I'm sure I get the sense that it's probably a very common some of the common ways in which X accounts get hacked is through phishing attempts and SIM swaps, maybe some kind of a security breach with a recovery email or something going wrong with two-factor authentication. This kind of stuff. I feel like it's intentional that Web2 accounts are not airtight in terms of security because you always want to leave some flexibility for user error. But that also, unfortunately, leaves room for hackers to take advantage of those loopholes or those kind of buffers and room for margins of error. And so, yeah, just making a small note that happened to one of the maintainers. And I strongly believe it's because Gloria was targeted because of her visibility as a Bitcoin Core maintainer and for her kind of role in Bitcoin. I think that there were hackers that might have thought, okay, if we hack her account, then maybe we can get a bunch of slide into use her DMs to try and get scam people out of money, people who have money and people who have a lot of Bitcoin, which is really just unfortunate. But that is kind of what happens when you have more visibility in the Bitcoin space and also broadly the crypto space, and also why, we can never be too careful on these social media platforms. Last final update around Bitcoin protocol development that I want to highlight is that the Bitcoin Improvement Proposal process, the BIP process, was finally updated. It's been close to a decade since the formal update of the BIP process. There was a change, a new document. It's called BIP3 that includes a bunch of kind of revisions to the way BIPs should be proposed, to the BIP life cycle, the different stages that a BIP will go through in terms of its review. There's been some changes to the categories and the types of BIPs so that one of the updates is that process BIPs like BIP3 can be updated on an ongoing basis. They don't need to be finalized, and any minor changes to it need to be proposed in a brand new BIP. There's been some updates to the BIP process that the Bitcoin community has agreed upon and finalized over the past week. There is a Bitcoin developer, his name is Merch, who led the efforts for this BIP3 document. And I'm very excited to share that he chatted with me about this BIP3 document and about his career journey as a Bitcoin developer. So for next week's Ready for Merge episode, you can stay tuned for a new Ready for Merge episode with another Bitcoin developer. That's right. I'm still going to continue the streak of this new year where I'm focusing a bit more on Bitcoin developers and Bitcoin development. So that episode with Merch is coming out next Wednesday. Please stay tuned. With that is your biweekly brief. You are officially caught up on what's ready for merge in Bitcoin and Ethereum. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please do check out the show notes for more information on any of the topics that we discussed today. Other than that, I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of their weeks. I will talk to you all again next week.